Mr. Speaker, sir, let me first thank all the members for speaking on this bill. I will address the specific points raised. I think this can be grouped into three broad set of issues. The first set of issues has to do with the provisions related to election candidates. The second set of issues relates to the management of contingencies. And the third set of issues have some unrelated issues which the Speaker have reminded us that's not relevant to this bill, but nevertheless I will make a few short remarks, in particular on the NCMP scheme. Let me begin with the provisions related to election candidates. Mr. Gan Thiam Poh suggested reducing the election deposit. The purpose of the election deposit is to ensure that only those who are serious in contesting in the elections step forward. I agree with him that we should not set the amount so high that it becomes a barrier to entry. But we also need to strike a balance. Setting at the current rate of 1 month of an MP's allowance has worked reasonably well since we first had elections in Singapore. And under the law, candidates who contest and gather more than 1/8 of the votes will have their election deposits returned to them after the election. Mr. Murali suggested that we continue to allow cash payment of election deposits. We agree with you. The amendments increase the options, not decrease the options in the mode of payment. We are encouraging candidates to use electronic funds transfer to make it more convenient for aspiring candidates so that they no longer need to withdraw cash or visit a bank to purchase a bank draft or to go to the Accountant General's Department to make the payment. Elections Department will also return the elections deposit using electronic fund transfer. And it is as per current process, the candidate has a choice of which method of fund transfer that they would like to use. As for cash, this is something the returning officer may allow when there are technical issues with electronic funds transfer system. So we have increased the number of choices rather than narrow it. Mr. Gan also suggested automating nomination forms. The Elections Department is looking into expanding its range of e-services to candidates and elections agents, and we will consider Mr. Gan's suggestion as part of their study. Mr. Murali spoke about possible unintended consequences from removing the need for candidates to submit supporting documents such as bills and receipts in their returns on election expenses. As there have not been any issue with these returns in the past, we propose to remove the need to submit these supporting documents to improve administration efficiency. But these supporting documents, the rest of the submissions is still required. This will not dilute accountability. The process for public inspection remains. The time necessary remains. Candidates are also required to keep these supporting documents for a period of 1 year, and the returning officer may require these documents for checks when needed. So the candidates still need to submit the necessary declarations. It's just that the supporting documents need not come with it unless there's a public inquiry, a public interest for this. Mr. Leon Pereira and Mr. Dennis Tan asked about why some of the issues are moved out of the Act, and that's because in our review, we make a distinction between operational matters, which can be done in the subsidiaries legislation, and the legislative matters which requires the Act. So there's no desire to take away some of the clauses that you all have mentioned, but we have shifted that into the subsidiary legislation so that we simplify the Act itself. On the issue of the polling agents, the number of the polling agents required, we have simplified this to make it according to the numbers of voters count rather than the number of polling booths. There is no intention to decrease or increase the number of polling agents overall, but this will allow us to better match the number of polling agents with the number of voters, and it will be an easier way for everyone to understand the processes. And that is only able because we have simplified the process and the organization within every polling station. The third issue raised by Mr. Leon Pereira is the issue of notification. It will be done simultaneously via the Gazette and also be available on the website. So this is made easily available for everyone to check when there's an announcement to be made by ELD. Next, let me touch on the management of contingencies. Mr. Gan and Mr. Walter Teixeira spoke about the proposed procedures should a ballot box be lost or destroyed. Let me state that if ballot boxes go missing or are destroyed, the proposed new sections 56DA and 56DB spell out the processes to handle such contingencies to maintain the integrity of the election. Fresh polls will be conducted if the number of votes affects the election's results for the electoral division. All voters assigned to the affected polling station will then have to recast their votes. And now this is key. This is because when voters drop their ballot papers into the ballot boxes in any polling station, they have a choice. It will not be possible for us to ascertain which voters cast their votes in the affected ballot box. So that's why it goes by the polling station rather than the individual voter. And this will only be done if the count, as I explained, affects the polling results for the electoral division. Then how do we know whether the affected votes might affect the election results? This is when the sum of the total number of affected voters and the total number of overseas voters from the affected electoral division is equal or more than the difference between the votes already counted for the top two candidates. The procedure we are proposing is not new. This contingency procedure has been in place for the presidential elections. Now, what is new is that the proposal to apply the same contingency procedures to parliamentary elections as well. Dr. Teixeira suggested to minimize the need for fresh poll by changing the polling procedures in the polling station. There's a downside to that because the current procedure is designed to allow voters to drop their ballot paper into any ballot box so that the voters can be assured of their voting secrecy as an added check. So this has served us well, and I think we will continue this current arrangement. There are also contingency provisions and procedures that we want to put in place. Dr. Teixeira observed that if there were lost or damaged ballot boxes in an SMC, chances would be higher for a fresh poll to be conducted. Let me assure members that there have been no instance in past elections of lost or damaged ballot boxes prior to the votes being counted. Consequently, there was no instance of repolling as a result of loss or destruction of ballot boxes. And if indeed ballot boxes get lost or damaged, the amendment in today's bill would lay out clearly in the law the steps to take to deal with such a scenario to ensure the integrity of the election process. And members have also asked, has there been any event that triggered us to review the current existing procedures? The answer is that this has always been part of our ongoing work in ELD to make sure that our processes are kept afresh. And as Member Walter Teixeira said, we need to think long term. We need to anticipate what may happen, even though it may not have happened yet. Dr. Teixeira asked if providing the minister with powers to decide how a repoll is to be done will be a conflict of interest. Now, let me assure members that the new section 56DA spells out clearly the procedures to be undertaken by the returning officer. When a ballot box is lost or destroyed after the close of polls in Singapore. This includes informing the candidates of the affected electoral division, publishing a notice in the Gazette that the returning officer has abandoned the counting of the votes cast in the affected polling station, or if there's a need for a fresh poll to specify the date, hours of the poll, and the location of the polling station, as well as a polling station. The provisions in section 56DA subsection 8 is to provide the minister with the powers to prescribe other operational details in the regulations if required, such as the notice to be placed outside the polling station. So in response to Member Mr. Dennis Tan, we are thinking ahead of the possible contingencies rather than it being triggered by any recent or past occurrence. And Mr. Dennis Tan also asked for the grounds of rejection. For the registration officers will reply to the claimant, and if the claimant so chooses, he or she may make public the reasons for the rejection. So it won't be the registration officer who make public the reasons for the rejection, but it's made available to the claimant, and he or she can make the necessary public announcement if they so choose to. I will now touch on other points raised by members. On the design of the ballot paper, we share Mr. Peng Eng Huat's and Mr. Gan Tian Po's concern for the elderly. And this is indeed the reason why we have recently refreshed our polling paper design. The use of black as the base color was introduced at GE 215 to help focus voters' attention on the box to mark their voting choice. The background for the parts containing the candidates' photos, graph, and symbols remain white so that these parts are clearly visible and contrasted, and in clear contrast to the voters. The election department took in the views of voters of different age groups when coming up with the new ballot paper design. And Mr. Peng Eng Huat asked about the adjudication process. I think we have very clear adjudication rules and process set up within ELD, and the ELD routinely conducts training for all the AROs, the GROs, and the GAROs, so that they can do their job professionally. But we should also put in context and view this in context, that how many of these votes actually go into adjudication. Actually, the answer is very few. But notwithstanding that, it's the very few that really require adjudication. We constantly make sure that the training of our ARO, the GARO, are all done systematically and done professionally. And they are not partisan to any particular party. They will adjudicate based on their professional judgment on how best this is to be done. So elections officers are trained to adjudicate based on whether the voter's choice is clear according to the law. Now, with the amendment to only consider markings in the demarcated area of the ballot paper, we will remind voters to mark their choices with an X for the candidate, or in the case of a group representation constituency, the group of candidates they are voting for in the demarcated area of the ballot paper. And Mr. Peng may like to help us to remind voters to mark the X at the demarcated area rather than to exercise their artistic talent in the polling station. Mr. Gan also asked if there have been previous cases of tampering with ballot boxes during an election. The answer is no. There is a rigorous process to ensure that there is no break in the chain of custody of the ballot boxes from the polling stations to the counting centres, and from the counting centres to the Supreme Court, where the ballot papers are retained in safe custody for a period of time before they are subsequently destroyed. For transparency, the process is open to observation by candidates and their agents. When sealed ballot boxes are transported from polling stations to counting centres, candidates and their polling agents may also board the buses to observe the process. For overseas votes, there is similarly a secure chain of custody. Sealed ballot boxes are transported back to Singapore by 2 election officials, and they are kept at the Supreme Court. They are then transported from the Supreme Court to the counting place to be counted. After counting, the ballot boxes are then transported back to the Supreme Court to be kept together with the local ballot boxes for 6 months before they are destroyed. On Mr. Gan and Mr. Peng Eng Huat's comment on election officials, let me first emphasize that elections are administered by public officers who have been trained to do their election duties according to the law in an impartial and transparent fashion. Election officials are not allowed to influence voters on who to vote for. Each voter decides for himself who to vote for. Where election officials have to communicate with voters, for example, in the case of the visually handicapped voters, to guide them on using the stencil, they do so in an audible voice so that candidates, agents, and other election officials around them can hear the conversations. I thank Mr. Gan for welcoming the use of maps to show the boundaries of polling districts. Dr. Teixeira asked if the move to an online-only publication of polling district will adversely affect historical records and hence future research. I would like to assure Dr. Teixeira that Elections Department will maintain a proper archive of the boundaries of polling districts and electoral divisions. Members of the public can also continue to view electoral boundaries interactively using the SLA One Map. They can also inspect or purchase this map in hard copies at the offices of SLA Elections Department. As with other public records, the maps would also be kept with the National Archives in due course.